This is Far From Home. I'm Scott Gurian. If you're a regular listener of my program, you know that I usually report from faraway places, or at least locations that are far removed culturally and geographically from my home in northern New Jersey. And on this fourth season of my show, you'll hear plenty of stories like that, but I've also realized that it's not always necessary to venture way across the ocean. Coming out of the pandemic a few years ago, I received an invitation to do some reporting just north of the border in Canada. Now, as you probably know, Canada and the United States are pretty similar in many ways, but there are also some subtle differences. So, as someone who's not from there, I was curious to explore some interesting topics with a fresh set of eyes. Today, I'm sharing one of the stories I produced for Here and There, a Canadian geographic travel podcast. And if you want to hear more of their episodes, I've linked to it in my show notes. The podcast is hosted by Liz Beattie, and I'll let her pick things up from here.
So what the heck is Canadian cuisine? This episode, we take a rather counterintuitive approach to solving this massive national identity question, but stick with me. We decided to plop an American, yes, an American, into one of Canada's most lively and diverse urban neighborhoods. I'm talking smack in the middle of Toronto's Kensington Market, amid a mishmash of vintage clothing stores, street musicians, artists, bars, food markets, and restaurants serving up fare from around the world. And we gave him a hint for this quest. We said start with one of our team's favorite Kensington Market eateries, a scrumptious, perhaps unlikely mashup of Jamaican and Italian influences. The result? Well, our New Jersey journalist and self-described foodie Scott Gurian was confused, but also eager to take up the challenge with an open mind and a hearty appetite. Here's Scott on the scene.
So, I love traveling, and without a doubt, trying new foods is absolutely the best part of visiting a place for me. I was thinking recently that I don't think I really know what Canadian cuisine is, so I've come here to try to figure that out. So I'm at the corner of, I guess this is Kensington Avenue and Baldwin Street. Here it is up on the left, Rasta Pasta. Not sure what this place is, okay. To be honest, I never really thought of all this as Canadian cuisine.
I'm Liz Beattie, and this is Here and There, a Canadian geographic travel podcast. You know the drill. We dig for big idea stories that might just reframe everything about the way travelers experience places and the people who live there. Scott, today you take us to the heart of Toronto and surrounds, talking to everyone from massive celebrity chefs to Polish Anishinaabe restaurateurs. And I have to say, your outsider perspective brings something special to this big question of Canadian identity.
Well, this topic is really relatable to me because, it seems like a lot of people in both of our countries often struggle to define their national foods. If you travel around Canada, you'll find lots of regional dishes, but there isn't really a strong national cultural identity the way there is if I mention like Italian food or Mexican food, for example.
Seems instead our diversity of culinary influences is somehow the secret sauce here. And if that's so, let's talk about why Toronto in particular is such a great place to start teasing apart our Canadian culinary riddle.
Toronto, it seemed like the perfect place to explore this topic because there are almost 200 languages spoken on the city's streets, and over half the residents were born outside of Canada. It's such a diverse place, and you could find pretty much any kind of food you want, even unusual combinations like mashups of Jamaican and Italian cuisine, or another place I heard about that actually combines food from Thailand and Hungary. So yeah, I really enjoyed the on-the-ground research of putting this piece together.
So where do we get started?
Okay, so I want to begin in sort of an unlikely place in the financial district of downtown Toronto. And I say unlikely because bustling cities tend to be places where most people don't give a lot of thought to where their food comes from. But it's here on the 54th floor of the TD Bank Tower that you'll find the nexus of a sort of Canadian food revolution. Hello there.
Good morning.
Beautiful spot you've got up here.
Thank you.
Decades before he became wildly successful as one of Canada's top celebrity chefs, before he opened nearly 30 restaurants across the country and became a household name through his appearances on MasterChef Canada, Michael Bonaccini stepped off an airplane, fresh from a stint in the kitchen of London's prestigious Dorchester Hotel. It was the mid-1980s. He was a 25-year-old kid from Wales, and at first he couldn't quite wrap his head around the Canadian palate.
I was taken aback a little because I'd never seen a Caesar salad, and that was one of the most popular salads that was being made and sold when I was the chef at the Windsor Arms Hotel. And it took me a while to understand what the popularity of a Caesar salad was all about.
At the time, he says many Canadian chefs seemed to be struggling to distinguish themselves and find their identity.
Some of the combinations of ingredients were a little sort of eye-popping and strange, whether it was strawberries being served with a poached fillet of sole or a banana dressing on a summery type salad with buttermilk. They seemed sort of hip and trendy and pretty cool at the time, and when you look back at photographs or old recipes, you think, oh my God, what was I doing? What was I thinking? Where were we going with all of this? This is embarrassing.
But Bonaccini had other plans. He spent several years working his way to the top of some of the finest restaurants in Toronto until stockbroker turned restaurateur Peter Oliver approached him in 1993. Together, they created Jump, a New York-style bar and restaurant with an unconventional vibe in the city's downtown financial district. It seemed at first like a bit of a gamble, opening in the midst of a recession in a then deserted part of town, but their leap of faith paid off, and before long, they were hosting everyone from CEOs to sports stars to celebrities. People noticed, and just a few years later, they received a call.
We were courted by the landlord and were asked if we would like to come and see a beautiful space 54 floors up to do another restaurant.
So they went over to take a look. The place seemed intriguing and had an incredible view, but they decided to turn it down to continue focusing on their core business. A few months later, the landlord approached them again, and finally a third time with an offer they couldn't refuse.
The day we signed the deal, Peter and I came and sat on a table right in this location. It was a June day, yachts out on the lake sailing, the ferry going across from the island, and Peter and I were discussing what is the right and best concept for this location. And then Peter said, I think we should do a restaurant that represents Canadian cuisine. It's the kind of restaurant, he said, that you and I would be proud of. We'd be proud to bring our family, our friends, that any dignitary of Canada would be proud to bring visiting dignitaries to, and it could become an iconic place that represents Canadian food and Canadian cuisine. I was hooked immediately, thought this was an incredible idea, and that was it.
The idea behind the restaurant that came to be known as Canoe was pretty revolutionary at the time, so although it sounded exciting, it took them a while to figure out exactly what it meant.
It was difficult for us in many different ways to fully understand what fit that Canadian cuisine idea. Did this ingredient, did this dish, did this compilation of ingredients? We know how the climate is here in Canada and how much more abundant, fresh and wonderful and exciting ingredients there are come late spring into mid-fall, but mid to late fall through winter is a tough and challenging time, and you have to navigate your way around those kinds of lumps and bumps, and you have to constantly be looking out for individuals who are pushing the boundaries when it comes to product, produce, foraging, growing, and hook up with them and identify and have them come and see you and check out these ingredients. You have to do research on recipes and look back to the original people that lived within Canada and the kinds of dishes that they would cook and prepare. How the Europeans arrived in Nova Scotia and what they brought with them and how they moved east and what parts of the country were known for its beef production or its vegetable growing or its fruit and great productions such as the Peninsula of Niagara here. And it really became a recipe that was a little geography, a little history, a little cultural, a little experimental. It was all of these things came together in a balanced way for us to build confidence and believe that the food that we were preparing and cooking and putting out to our guests was a good, strong, solid representation in our minds of Canadian cuisine.
25 years later, Canoe has earned its place as one of the most revered high-end dining establishments in all of Toronto, and thanks in no small part to Bonaccini and his colleagues, the notion that Canada does in fact have its own unique culinary heritage no longer seems like such a crazy idea. But enough with the talk. I wanted to see what all this meant in the real world, so I headed back to the kitchen where I met Canoe's executive chef, Ron McKinley.
Every dish that we do here will highlight or use or incorporate a Canadian ingredient to the best of our abilities. You know, we don't want to be over the top about it, and this restaurant is 100% Canadian, but every single dish will have a touch of a Canadian ingredient for sure. Whether it's Nova Scotian swordfish or lamb that we get from Tamarack Farms, which is just an hour and a half away. Even these scallops coming off the East Coast as well, the scallops that I'm breaking down now. Our beef on the menu is Ontario beef. You know, you're not going to see things like avocados on the menu here just because it's so foreign to our soils that it doesn't make sense.
Of course, I couldn't come all the way here without sampling some of the fare myself, so I took Chef Ron up on his recommendation.
So this is the wild halibut from BC. On the very bottom is a pomme puree. With the pomme puree, when we're breaking down the halibut, all the trim from it, we salt it, we poach it in milk. We use that milk to make the mashed potatoes. Then we flake the trim from the halibut through the mashed potatoes as well, so there's no wastage. On top of that is a warmed sea lettuce tartare sauce that we make. Again, that sea lettuce is foraged on the East Coast, just off of Nova Scotia. And then on top, there's a bunch of crispy onions, some crispy tapioca that we finished with seaweed as well. There's some poached onions with, we poached them in a dashi. And then some wild spring onions, and then some just little herbs and stuff to finish off. So yeah, that's it. Enjoy.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
It looked like a work of art, and let me tell you, it was really good. Now, it's one thing to sit atop a skyscraper in downtown Toronto discussing the ins and outs of sourcing Canadian ingredients, but if you really want to understand what Canadian cuisine means, your best bet is to go directly to the source. And for that, I met up with Chef Sean Adler at his restaurant, the Flying Chestnut Kitchen, a few hours north in Eugenia, Ontario. Sean has an interesting perspective given his diverse background. He told me about it as we walked around his property, joined by his 9-year-old daughter, Rywin.
My mother is an Anishinaabe, so she's Ojibwe from Lac First Nation. My father's a Polish Jew. So like one weekend, you know, we could be at a powwow or a sweat and, you know, eating that sort of food, or next weekend I could be having a Seder, right? And having like gefilte fish and matzo balls. So it's kind of an interesting mix, but like I grew up in Southern Ontario, so my food was not unlike a lot of other people's at the same time as like being exposed to sort of indigenous food and Polish Jewish food. I was eating craft dinner with everyone else, right?
For Adler, eating local isn't some popular foodie trend he tries to follow. It's a family tradition.
During the seasons, we love to forage for things to supplement the menu. Of course, I'm teaching my daughter. My mom taught me. And my mom, she learned a lot when she was at residential school, actually. So when they were at school, they had, you know, not enough to eat. So all the kids, they knew everything to eat around the school. So my mom would always, when we're in the bush, she'd be like, oh, there's choke cherries, there's rose hips, there's, you know, everything. She'd always be pointing out. So that kind of inspired me as well, just to continue on the path of learning.
To an untrained eye, the patch of land behind Adler's home and restaurant might seem fairly unremarkable, because much of it is forest or what might generally be considered clumps of weeds. But if you know where to look, you'll never go hungry.
This is all garlic mustard that's going to seed. This is actually an invasive weed, which we use it a lot. We make pesto out of it. We saute it and just use it as greens, put in pastas. So we have lilacs. We make a lot of things with lilac syrup. We've also planted a bunch of Jerusalem artichokes, which hopefully we'll take. That's like a Indian potato. All these, like these cedars all along here, we use all the time for our cedar soda. And then so on here as well, we come for our wild grapes. You can see the vines.
I don't know that I've ever had a wild grape. Are they different than cultivated grapes?
Yeah, they're really grapey. Like when you eat them, you're like, whoa, that's a grape.
Despite the success of restaurants like Canoe, Adler thinks it's crazy that most Canadians still don't recognize these foods that may be growing literally in their own backyards.
It's kind of funny that you can go in and get a mango and an avocado all year long, but you can get a fiddlehead maybe in season now, and maybe for the last 5 years. Like before that, you never saw fiddleheads. You don't see wild leeks, maybe at a farmer's market. Very rarely will you see venison or rabbit or duck. You know, duck in Chinatown, of course, but you know, a lot of other places you don't see the foods of Canada, which is kind of odd that like they haven't taken off.
But that's slowly changing, he says, thanks to more and more First Nations chefs like himself who are helping to popularize these wild ingredients.
I think there is definitely a newfound like appreciation and understanding and awareness that there is Indigenous cuisine. Because before everyone thought it was just fry bread or bannock. And it's like, well, you know, there's like so many different Indigenous cultures across Canada. Like out east, they're eating flipper pie, right? Like seal. And up north, they're eating like whale. And down here, it's like gardening, three sisters, right? Corns, beans, and squash. And then the plains is buffalo, you know, where my family's from is like pickerel, wild rice around the Great Lakes region. It's like as much as Indigenous cuisine is wanting to be defined, just like Canadian cuisine wants to be defined, you can't even define Indigenous cuisine for the same reason. It's a time and a place and a terroir that inputs, you know, what it is that goes on the plate.
So, yeah, if you want to understand what Canadian cuisine means, turning to the local food of its original inhabitants is a good starting point, but nailing down a clear definition is still hard in a country that's so large with so much diversity. Besides, First Nations people are far from the only ones laying claim to ownership of this national cuisine. Anyway, before we go any further, we should probably go back to the basics. To the extent that the average person has any notion at all of what Canadian food entails, it's probably a pretty short list that includes things like poutine and maple syrup, which Michael Bonaccini described to me as culinary whimsical tchotchkes. And no disrespect, because who doesn't love a good butter tart? But they're really just the tip of the iceberg. Still, as a non-Canadian, I felt like I needed to start here because I wasn't entirely familiar with all these iconic Canadian foods. So one Saturday morning, I signed up for Jessup Sim's Great Canadian Food Tour that he leads regularly in Toronto's Kensington Market.
I will warn everybody that there is a significant amount of food on this tour. The vast majority of my guests leave really well satiated. So do not feel compelled that you have to eat every bite.
Over the course of several hours, we walked around the neighborhood, sampling and learning the backstories of everything from Canada Dry ginger ale to Nanaimo bars. And Jessup was a great guide, but as he told me later, his real passion is another tour he leads of Toronto's international street food.
There's over 25,000 restaurants in the city, so you need multiple lifetimes if you want to eat all of them. There's no shortage of options here because literally any country you can think of, there's somebody who's making that food. We have a restaurant in Kensington Market where a Hungarian man married a Thai woman and opened up a restaurant where you can get schnitzel with your pad thai. How do you categorize this? Right? And so I would love Toronto to figure out a marketing strategy to explain in simple terms this melting pot of food that is always changing.
And somehow it all seems to work. In this city that's one of the most diverse places in the world, crime is low and folks from different backgrounds generally get along.
People who are racist are usually picky eaters, right? And the more picky eater you are, the likelihood of you having biases for other cultures through food becomes much more prevalent. But if you grow up in Toronto and you have an adventurous palate, you'll never be bored.
So what does Canadian cuisine mean to Jessup?
I reference this to my ex-father-in-law who used to make German eggs. We didn't know what German eggs was. He goes, it's just eggs made by a German. So the food here, if it's made by a Canadian, it's Canadian.
But I know that's a weird thing to say because it's such a foreign concept of food because we're such a young country, right? We're still trying to find our way.
So while the concept of Canadian food is difficult to pigeonhole, it's precisely that messiness that makes it so incredibly interesting. Sushi chef Sang Kim immigrated to Canada from Korea as a child in the mid-1970s, trying to bridge the gap between two culinary worlds. As a kid in the school lunchroom, he'd be horrified when his mom would pack kimchi in his Spider-Man lunchbox because it didn't exactly help in his effort to make friends. So for a long time, he was ashamed of his own culture's cuisine and resorted instead to Wonder Bread and processed cheese to fit in with his white classmates. Then, in his 20s, he went through a prodigal phase, which started off with incorporating simple condiments like chili paste and sesame oil, and eventually led to him opening an Asian restaurant. As Kim sees it, the food he now makes is just as much a part of his adopted country's culinary heritage.
Canadian cuisine is, in some ways, a postmodern idea. It's continually shifting and changing and finding itself at a new place all the time. The easy things are to talk about the tradition that comes to us from the French and from the English, right? And refer to those things as being Canadian. But Canada is not only increasingly, but it will be by 2050. I mean, most people are going to classify themselves as some form of BIPOC.
To those critics who resist expanding the definition of Canadian cuisine to include more recent multicultural influences, he counters with this example.
You look at something like ginger beef that was invented in the prairies in Saskatchewan. When people eat ginger beef, they eat it at a Chinese restaurant. That's where it was invented, right? But it's not a Chinese dish in the sense that it was actually something that was prepared in China. It's a completely Canadian invention. But people, because they eat it at a Chinese restaurant, will just think that it's a Cantonese dish that's been around for thousands of years, and that's not true.
And he says eaters across the country have reaped the benefits of being exposed to so many types of foods.
What's glorious about the Canadian palate is that because it touches so many different cultures and different types of cuisine, it's very well adapted to different flavors in a way that if I was born and still living in Korea, I would not be able to say that. Yeah, I could probably pick up notes in a very specific regional famous dish that I might not be able to pick up here, but a broader understanding of what I'm tasting I get because I have a Canadian palate.
Nick Liu is the chef and owner of Dai-Lo restaurant in Toronto, where he serves what he calls new Asian cuisine. He's also a big fan of the diversity in the Canadian food scene and the willingness of its citizens to try just about anything. As the one in the kitchen preparing the meals, he finds it really liberating.
I'm not put into any type of box which I feel like I need to follow. I think that's what's special about, not having these kind of immediate thoughts about, okay, Italian food, yes, this is Italian food. Now you have to do this if you're an Italian restaurant. Mexican food, this is what we're going to do because we're Mexican. We have to follow these guidelines, these rules, these ingredients, these techniques. Where, if you're just opening a Canadian restaurant, it's open to interpretation and you can borrow different ideas and different inspirations that you've had while you're traveling. Or even someone that you had sitting next to you in school that you had a taste of their lunch back in the day when you were a kid.
And free from the limitations that chefs in other places might face, he's had room to experiment.
I have a poutine on my late night menu, which is a mapo version of mapo tofu. And I use that same mapo sauce that we use for our tofu dish on the menu. And then we use that as the gravy. And it's amazing. With cheese curds, it's incredible, right? Because cheese curds is kind of a form of a tofu curd. And it's the same sort of thing, almost the same kind of texture, except you get this beautiful richness and pull. So, it's when you grow up with all these kind of experiences and these things in your life, there's a lot of kind of similarities in a lot of ingredients that you can find when you're not held to any kind of structure or boundaries.
Which all leads me back to something I recalled Michael Bonaccini telling me.
I remember reading a little something somewhere about James Beard. He was considered the godfather of American cuisine, and he was once asked, what is American cuisine? And he stopped for a moment, turned round and said, American cuisine is anything that you eat at home. And that was a transformational moment for me.
Because he realized that that was the case in Canada as well. Basically, it doesn't matter what part of the world you came from or what background or experiences you bring with you to the kitchen, because once you arrive, you'll inevitably end up fusing your cultural influences with those of your newfound home, incorporating local ingredients, and suddenly, there you have it, Canadian cuisine. Armed now with this new insight, it was time for me to grab some dinner at, where else? Rasta Pasta. I entered the restaurant and took a seat where I was greeted by co-owner Mary Nelia.
What are your favorite things on the menu?
Well, our jerk chicken is second to none. So that's our signature dish. And then we're known as no other restaurant does it, fusion of Jamaican and Italian food. So things like jerk chicken lasagna, or a scampi linguine in a coconut curry sauce, or the namesake Rasta Pasta dish that's gnocchi, which is Italian, little potato dumplings, served with your choice of sauce, either Alfredo, marinara, or rosé, alongside ackee and saltfish, which is the Jamaican national dish.
I'm actually really curious about this fusion cuisine, so I think I'm going to order the Rasta Pasta dish. You know, when I was booking my flight and coming up here to Toronto and planning to do a story on Canadian cuisine, this is not exactly what I was expecting.
Thank you so much, Scott. That's our show. We want to give a big thank you to Michael Bonaccini for all his help and insight and being so generous with his time. And to Mary Nelia at Rasta Pasta for putting up with a pesky reporter constantly asking to turn down the music while he was recording. Thanks to chefs Michael Hunter, Taylor Parker, and Sujit Raj, whom we interviewed but unfortunately didn't have space to include. Oh, and since Scott reported on this episode, Chef Sean Adler of the Flying Chestnut Kitchen in Eugenia, Ontario, has a new show on APTN TV. As always, thanks to Destination Canada for their ongoing support. We highly recommend checking out Canada's bestnewcookbook.com, a collaboration between Destination Canada and Air Canada. It's a totally unique showcase of Canadian cuisine, celebrating the outstanding people, places, ingredients, and dishes that make this country so tasty. Also, our friends at Air Canada and DC tell us that new to Toronto's wildly diverse culinary scene is the expansion of the Michelin Guide. From Fat Pasha's Middle Eastern treats to elevated gastro pub grub at The Ace. The full list of 74 recognized restaurants can be found in the Michelin Guide Toronto. Here and There is produced by Black Cabin Studio for Canadian Geographic Travel. See you next time.
Thanks again to Liz Beattie and Here and There, a Canadian Geographic travel podcast, for giving me permission to share my story with Far From Home listeners. If you're interested in more stories from around Canada, you could find Here and There at canadiangeographic.ca or wherever you listen to podcasts. I'll be back soon. Thanks for listening.